Turn with me in your Bibles to the book of Ecclesiastes. We're going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 9 through 15. So open your copy of the Scriptures, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 9 through 15, and follow with me. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end, I perceive there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it, so that people fear before him. That which is, already has been. That which is to be, already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we come before you and we give thanks that we beseech the God of glory, that the very God who spoke and created, the one who knitted from the dust and made man in his image, breathed life into him. The God who has numbered our days, who has made plain what you would have for us. And in your sovereign decree, you have appointed, even as we've seen in the earlier chapter of Ecclesiastes 3, a time and a season for all things. And in their time and season, they are beautiful, they are fitting, they are good. And you are a God who's given us work. And you're a God who's given us good things. And you have placed eternity into the hearts of men. And this is a tension and a toil and a struggle. But it's a reflection that there's more than this temporal life. So how might we live before you in light of these things? Well, that we would fear you. That we would fear our God and that we would keep your commandments. Lord, we ask now that we would have your help. We're going to Ecclesiastes 3, verses 9 through 15, and they can be talked through, they can be discussed, but we need your help that they would be articulated clearly, and that when and if articulated clearly, they would be received, and that your people would go out as better worshipers, better obedient followers, clearer thinkers in terms of truth. So, Lord, we ask that you would be our help. It's your word, and this is your time, and so we ask, magnify your name. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. I very briefly return back to the theme of the book and in terms of how I look at the book of Ecclesiastes as a whole. And I think if you're going to go to chapter 3, there's an expectation that you understand 1, 2, 3, 1 through 8, and that you've spent time in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. 3 is not an island just floating out there. And so we need to be mindful. Where does it fit, and how does this book work, and what are we looking at? So I see the theme of the book, just in general terms, the king or preacher's investigative process of evaluating and understanding life, resulting in a philosophical theology, an argument rooted in wisdom and vanity that concludes not all striving is after wind if, and there's that qualifier, if one fears God and keeps his commandments. And as we observed when we began chapter 3, when Pastor Josh went through verses 1 through 8, there's a shift from the primary attention that's given in chapter 2 on personal experience to the common observation of all men. In chapter 2, it was, these are things I've wrestled with. These are things I've toiled with. These are things that I've experimented and I've tried to strive and understand. And then chapter 3, it's a common experience of man and creation and time. And in our passage, we'll see several thematic elements of which are developed throughout the book. And again, we look at chapter 3 through the paradigm of the whole of Ecclesiastes. And there's several elements that I hope that they'll prick your attention. And as you see them here, that you'll see them when we get to verses 16 and following in chapter 4. And these elements, these thematic elements that are present here and that develop and that have a place and they need to be learned from and gleaned from, things such as gain. He starts off with a question about what gain is it? He talks about toil, and we know that's a constant theme. He talks about time, definitely a superior theme in chapter 3 here. He talks about that man cannot find out, man cannot know. And that's a tension there, and that's a tension that we're going to resolve or address at least. We're going to talk about perception. I perceived. He is an observer. King Solomon, the preacher, is an observer of man and of God and the things of this world. He talks about nothing better, and that should always get our attention, because if we don't like the toil and the struggle, we certainly should hone in when it says there's nothing better, because we want what is nothing better. We see God's gift, and that's always a gracious thing to find. We see a drive to fear, specifically to fear God. And we see that what has been and what will be. And finally, by way of thematic emphasis, we'll see God's work. God's work, which is the binding element, the theme that runs throughout chapter 3, verses 9 through 15, is effectually not just time and eternity, but it's actually God's work. It's Solomon observing the works of God and the affairs of men. So we have God's work as a binding theme of the passage, what God has done and how man finds his place, his value, how he responds accordingly. We look at 3:10 and we see that God has given. 3:11, God has made, God has put, God has done. 3:14, God does and God has done. 3:15, God seeks. He is the active agent in our text, and it demands that we give him attention. So we see that the emphasis primarily is on God's works, and that it's focused over against man's works, which find their value and their direction in the very works of God. So you want to understand man and his works and his toil and his struggle, then you need to look at the works of God. And something that we need to keep in mind as we address 3:9 is that man's works are subordinate to God's works. They're subordinate to it. It's not just about the works of man, it's about the works of God. Therefore, here we have the works of man. Now, as we turn our attention to our text proper, 3:9 through 15, it breaks down into 4 parts, and I want to remind you that it's a God-focused section, whereas again, chapter 2 is more Solomon-focused. It's very God-focused. It's elevating it was elevating his experiences and evaluations to the works of God. So we need to keep that in mind, just as I've said. And here, following a recognition that there is a time and season for everything because of God's good order. You remember that? 3:1 through 8. I know it's been 2 weeks, but there's a season and a time for everything. So we're following that. It's coming right off the heels of that poem. And here we immediately are asked, in view of that, in view of there's a season and a time for this and for that and this and that, in view of that, what about man's toil? And it's framed in God's work as God has given man this business, and therefore he who makes everything beautiful in its time also gives its meaning and joy. Further, it is not for man to concern himself with how God will choose to work the larger matters out, particularly after one's passing. If you want to understand why does he keep saying vanity and toils and struggles, it's because he knows he's going to die, because he lives in the limitation that Moses articulated in Psalm 90, that there is a limited time for which man will live and he will die. And Solomon is struggling with that, and he's saying, I know there's eternity because God's put it in my heart. So how do I understand these things? Is it all just a waste? So God gives one's toil meaning and satisfaction now, satisfaction in the present. But it is God's works that are enduring. Man can find satisfaction in his work, but it's God's works that are enduring. Finally, God's works are not only kind, but are driving man to do what? To fear before him. Did you see that? God's driving man to fear before him. So now we're prepared to go to verse 9. We've laid the table out. God's works, man's works, how do we relate in times of time and eternity? Well, let's wrestle through it with Solomon. He opens up with a question in verse 9. He states, what gain has the worker from his toil? And I think it's always wise to ask things of the text. I know our text is a question, but I think it's also prudent to ask, why this question here? We've just had this magnificent poem, and now we have this question. We have this question of what gain is the worker from his toil? So regarding the worker and his toil, when the text was just addressing these things of seasons and experiences, well, to begin with, the question is one that is framed in the tension of time and toil. Now, if you miss anything else, don't lose sight of that, because you'll miss the text. And if you miss the text, I think you've really lost your bearings in Ecclesiastes. And that's not just because I'm myopically focused on 3:9 through 15. I think I've seen finally why Solomon's so struggling. It's the tension of time and toil. This is a consistent tension throughout the book. Again, you can't just stand on the island of chapter 3. So looking throughout the book, there's a constant tension of time and toil. Now, there are such things as dumb questions, and I think it's a tragedy that people say, well, there's no such thing as a dumb question. There is. There's an abundance of dumb questions. But a good question is rooted in an informed understanding of the subject matter. And Solomon is keenly aware of this tension of time and toil, and he uses the tool of asking a good question, an informed question, a question that's based out of wise observation of the affairs of man and the affairs of God and the working of this creation, and he uses a good question to draw out the tension. He says, there's a tension there, and I'm going to draw it out, and I'm going to start off with this question. What gain is the worker from the toil? And he's asking that again following the poem about time. So several times throughout the book, he'll use questions, but I think there's a question that would be helpful to our text today. He's consistently asking what gain has a worker from his toil. Now, there is one question in particular that I think this one is actually borrowing from, or it's primed off of, and that's in chapter 1, verse 3, where he states, quote, "What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun?" That's verse 3. He's setting the stage for the book. And I think right here in 3:9, where he starts to address the tension and how to resolve that tension, I think he goes back and he says, remember that question? What gain has the worker from his toil? 1:3, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? It's not what's in it for me, but how do I understand my work, my life, my experience? Solomon's wise, so let's listen and heed to his counsel. This ultimately has to be, our question in 3:9 has to be a philosophical question, though, because we know neither the work or its potential gain. So can we answer it? Can we answer the question, what gain has the worker from his toil? We don't know the nature of this work, and we don't know the nature of the toil, and therefore we can't know the potential gain. It's more of a philosophical question. So with this in mind, I'm persuaded that the larger problem Solomon has with a man's toil is the matter of what comes of it, or who benefits from it after one's death. Again, the matter that's really getting in Solomon, and it's just really agitating him, and he's asking, is it all vanity? He wants to know, when I've labored, when a king has riches, when a man works hard, when he's dead, what comes of his work? Is it all just vanity? And the reason he's struggling with that is right here in our text. That's why I think it's so critical that you get 3:9 through 15. So walk with me here as we continue to address the tension of this question. We also saw this tension when Pastor Rick was going through chapter 2, verses 18 to 23. And again, there's an expectation that you're walking through Ecclesiastes. If you're not walking through Ecclesiastes, this is like a briar patch, and it's very thick and dense. And if you haven't made a walkway, if you haven't treaded it well, and for many seasons, this is going to be hard. So just walk with me, and if it's a struggle, be prepared for next week, because it's expecting that you're here and that you're studying and you're giving attention to it. So 2:18 to 23, a couple weeks back, where Solomon does not appear to see a lot of gain for one's toil, as it is indiscriminately left for another who did nothing to receive it. What gain is it? It's just left to the next guy. He didn't do anything. I believe this was likely a contributing element to this question in 3:9. And while it's functionally a rhetorical question, philosophical question, rhetorical question, the remainder of the passage, 10 through 15, will provide its answer regarding the tension of time and toil. So let's go to 10 through 11. He states in the text, "I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end." Now, I don't like to qualify too many things when I'm preaching or teaching. One thing I will do is I won't close my Bible. That's a signal that it's over. The Bible stays open, and I don't like to qualify, well, this is going to be a long point, but I am going to preface it. Walk with me. This will be the longest point that we make, but if you lose me here, I think you're going to lose this. You're going to lose 3, you're going to lose Ecclesiastes. So prepare yourself. Let's think through this together. The scriptures have an expectation that it's not all lollipops and bubblegum. It's some work involved. So let's walk together, 3:10 through 11. It'll be our longest, most challenging section, but rewarding. So this is our second section, Solomon's observation regarding man's great tension with time and toil. Are you getting the repetitious theme yet? Tension with what? Time and toil. Walk with me. This section begins with the first of three observations. I have seen. Then in 3:12, he's going to say, I perceived. In 3:14, I perceived. So this is the first observation, I have seen. Solomon was clearly a student of his world, of men, of God, and God's dealings with men. So when he says, I've seen these things, he's been graced with wisdom from God Almighty, and then he's saying, I'm applying my wisdom, I'm observing the affairs of men, and these are some conclusions. So you couple the wisdom of Solomon with the skills of observation, makes for an exceptional resource for life and understanding its beauties, struggles, and tensions. So here we have his observation of the work that God has given man under the sun. And then the statement that follows that everything is beautiful in its time. This after, again, the poem 1 through 8. There's a time and season for everything, as we saw earlier. So now, among other things, this observation seems to be in contrast. Does the scriptures, do they contrast each other? No. Where there's tension and apparent contrast, it's for us to resolve. But it seems to be in contrast to 1:13 to 14, where Solomon states, quote, it is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind. And why does it appear to be a contrast? Because here he's going to address both the tension of time and toil and the wonderful gift God gives in man's work. God's gift, things being beautiful. And then he's struggling with the tension and the value earlier, but we're going to see some resolution. So here we see that Solomon is making, again, a sweeping observation, as can be observed by the breadth of his target. He states in our passage, children of man. That's not just a limited group of persons. He's talking to you, children of man, those who are descendants of Adam, those who are natural man. This is a very broad, and its application was not limited to certain persons under his observation. Where was he? Well, he's the king in Jerusalem. Thousands of years ago, he's making observations, but this is an observation of man, and it will apply to you as well. And so, as with all men, there are both tensions and truths that supersede both culture and time. Don't get caught up with being a good hermeneutic student and saying, what's the historical context? Yes, but when he says, I've observed these things and they're true for all men, recognize that this will supersede culture and time. And we must recognize that our theology should influence things such as our understanding of work, as he addresses in the text. It's a business that God has given to man to be busy with. He has made man to work, and work is never man's problem. So much as is the relationship of time and toil. That's the tension. It's not the work, it's the nature of time and toil. So this business, this work, has been given to man by God, and man is to be busy with it. He's to be humbled by it, subdued, even afflicted with it. God has given man work, and he expects man to work. You see that. You see that here in the text. I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. We are designed, created by God to work and to be busy about the work the Lord's entrusted to us. The problem's not work, it's the fact that we're going to die, and we're going to die in such a limited time, and Solomon's wrestling with that. Wrestle with him. Well, there's some resolution. We'll go on to verse 11 here. And verse 11 states, just by way of refresher here, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Think back 1 through 8. Again, he's made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. So we're going to pursue some resolution shortly here. So as we move on to 3:11, we begin to see the overt or the clear work of God as drawn out in the text. And this is important because there's so very much discussion about toil and work if you've read the book of Ecclesiastes. Over and over again, we've tried to labor that to you, to say key themes or repetitious items: toil, work, struggle, vanity. So how do we understand that? It's critical to recognize that man's work finds its value and meaning in God's work. And this is God's work. I've observed the works of God. That's what he said 4, 5, 6 times there. Its meaning and quality is rooted in God's work. And being that this is a direct addressment of God's work here in our text, we can also expect that it will inform us regarding man's work too. You want to understand man's work? Understand God's work. So we see that God has made, God has put, and God has done. First, God has made everything beautiful or appropriate in its time. Now, you might have wrestled with some of that. Were you squirming 2 weeks ago, or is it just because you're familiar with the text? War and struggle. You might have wrestled with some of the elements listed in the poem, that these things are beautiful in their time. Things such as, again, weeping, mourning, death. But you must remember the place of the book in redemptive history, that Solomon was the king of a theocratic kingdom, a national people group of covenant promise. There was indeed a time for war. They had a promised land. It was to be conquered. It was to be defended. It was to be protected. There was a time and a context for other difficult things as well, as there is a season and a time for such matters with us as well. And they are beautiful in their time. Further, the semantic range of the various ways that the word for beautiful here can be translated leads several persons to translate it as appropriate. So he's made everything appropriate in its time. That's an acceptable within the semantic range, and I'm sympathetic to this conclusion. And I do think it's correct in that God has made all things appropriate in their time as he sovereignly orchestrates all things. We recognize that. We even heard that this morning again. Significant emphasis on these things, that the God is the God of these order, and he will accomplish as he says. But I'm also comfortable to state that he has made in all things attractive or beautiful in their time because they've been divinely put there by God. He has ordered these events, and this is beautiful. But it does produce a degree of tension because it demands that man recognize that God is Lord of man's time and the events of man that unfold in time. That's hard for us because if he's the one making them beautiful in their time and in their place, then it's him that is Lord over these things. And there is but one Lord over these affairs. So further making everything beautiful or appropriate in its time, it's amazing. It should be encouraging that this is what sovereignty looks like. It's not just pound the pulpit on God is in control of all things, but it's also beautiful, it's appropriate, it's attractive. And this is framed in a context of finding value in the temporal element of work and posterity. So not only are all things beautiful, but it's also specifically beautiful in the context of man will live but so long. Man has been given work to do. Man has given these things, and it's beautiful in its appropriate time and context. So the tension of toil and time begins to subside under this wonderful truth, because that tension can't hold up to the fact that this is what the Lord has, and it's good. But now we need to tackle the tension rather head-on here, and it's found in 3:11. We've obviously read 3:11, but specifically, he put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Tremper Longman states regarding this portion of the text, this verse is widely thought to be one of the hardest in the book to interpret. So always very encouraging when that's the text you're assigned, isn't it? And in seriousness, though, I don't include this to be cute. I don't include that quote in there to be cute, but because this verse is challenging, and here's why. Again, I'll pick up the quote and I'll finish it now. This verse is widely thought to be one of the hardest in the book to interpret, but its difficulty is not a function of the vocabulary. Taken individually, the words are fairly common. The question centers on their precise meaning in the present context. And that's always our objective. I don't want you to lose Ecclesiastes, but if you're going to lose Ecclesiastes, don't lose this. It is always, always our objective. If we're going to stand before any of the beloved and exhort you from the scriptures, it is always our objective to not lose sight that we have to pursue and understand the precise meaning in the present context. So now it's a challenge. How do we understand it? Because I can tell you, you can do word studies. Eternity. Heart. Man. It's not very difficult, but when you put them together, what does it mean? In some regards, I would say the book of Ecclesiastes is a complicated knot. And I don't know how many of you got things in a mess, but knots can be difficult sometimes. And this right here is a tangle within the knot. It's not a solo talking point that you can wax eloquent on or develop into a theological assumption. Oh, eternity in man's heart, and just pluck it up and let it sing and dance on its own terms. No. It's an element that deserves singular attention that fits back into the larger text. So let's do the work. Begin with, let me state that one more time, this is not a solo text, but a text that belongs in the larger whole. So here's both the challenge and the key. Here's the challenge and the key. Quote, also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. The challenge, tension of time and toil. If I ask you after the service, what was the thing I kept repeating? Get it. The tension of time and toil. That's the challenge. But I think it's also the key is right here. The key to understanding that tension is God put eternity in man's hearts. We need to grapple with how is the infinite, the forever, contained in the finite, in the temporal. How does eternity in the heart obstruct or limit a full understanding of God's workings? And you might say, what? Look at your text. God has put eternity, that which has no beginning and will have no end, into man's heart, that which is finite, that which Moses says in Psalm 90, if you've walked with us, man is from dust and will return to dust. The infinite contained in the finite. And for what reason? So that man cannot find out what God has done. The infinite within the finite to obstruct. So we have some work to do. What does that mean? How does that put stress and frustration in the heart of Solomon? Well, let's directly address what eternity in the heart means. We will address what eternity in the heart means, but first I want to address the challenge that is present to Solomon and man as a whole, as articulated throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. The concept of man not being able to find out. Did you see that? Yet, so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. That's a challenge. That's a challenge that Solomon faces over and over and over. Read, listen to Ecclesiastes over and over and over and over again. It's frustrating that he cannot discern the ways of God. In 3:22, quote, so I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? Enjoy your work. You're going to be dead and you don't know what follows. Okay? 6:11 through 12. Man so desperately craves to know what will follow him. 7:14, quote, God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. Live, die, don't know what comes next. 8:17, quote, then I saw the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. God's work, man can't discern it. 10:14, no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? You don't know, you're going to die, what's going to follow? Mystery. 11:5, quote, you do not know the work of God who makes everything. Do you see this? You see? And where did all that root back to? It rooted right back to 3:11, that God's put eternity in the heart of man so that he won't understand these things. So it appears to me that a major element of Solomon's tension, not knowing what will come after him, and all his work and potentially robbing it of merit and meaning, was an element overtly infused into the equation by God. In other words, this tension of what will follow is on account of God putting eternity into the hearts of man. So let's engage eternity in the hearts. Among all creation, among all that which was created, who alone is made in the image and likeness of God? Who has been given an awareness of history and future? A history that does not include you, and a future which will go on without you. Man is but dust. Moses, again, Psalm 90, 70 years, if your strength endures, maybe 80. And the Lord's kindness, many are on borrowed time. And there's perseverance with that. And that's a bit of a proverbial structure to make the point that man's years are brief. Solomon understood that. And when God puts eternity in the hearts of man, man can realize, boy, there was a lot that came before me. And there's going to be a lot that follows me. And so how do I understand my work? Because all that I've done, it will continue. And that bothers me. Man is made to effectively feel the reality of eternity and the limitation of the immediate and present constraints of time. He feels both. He knows I'm limited and there's limitless. And it's right here in my heart. And in so many ways, it's unclear as to where he fits into both this limitation of time and the surpassing of time. There's a tension there. Where do I fit into this? It is in this status of being personally confined and understanding the unconfined workings of God that are beyond what man can observe or understand, and this provokes great tension. He understands, but he knows he can't understand. So further being mindful again of where the book falls in terms of redemptive history, remember King Solomon, the third king of Israel. Israel's at their apex. There's a lot of history that's going to follow them. So remember where it is in terms of redemptive history. There weren't that many prophets that have spoken, not like they will under the other kings and not like they will. And there's certainly not been the unveiling of the revelation of God that gives us a much more precise and clear understanding of time and eternity. We have a high privilege of understanding that, yes, I will go to the grave. Yes, I have looked forward to resurrection. And yes, God's unfolded in his kindness at this point in times of redemptive history. We get a good idea of what will come. Solomon left with much tension, though. And there's a lot of tension left for us because we can all still say, when I'm done, I've labored, if the Lord gives me strength and I shepherd here for 60 years, if he'd be pleased to give that kind of strength, I know there will be a time when they put me in the ground and what's going to happen? All that work, what's going to come of it? Will the next man be faithful? So it would appear that as Tremper Longman argues, that God has created an appetite in man that man cannot satisfy. God has given man a hunger, and man can't satisfy that hunger. Now, the term eternity in our passage here is actually contested on some level, and I want to walk with you through this, not for academic gratification, but because it will help us grasp what we're working with here. It's another element of understanding this. So how the word is translated in the English Standard Version that I've been working out of and most contemporary translations is eternity. And that is a matter of debate, and the two most popular conclusions being to keep the word eternity, as we're accustomed to seeing, reading, and hearing eternity in our hearts, eternity in man's heart, or to accept another merit-worthy conclusion and translate the word knowledge or ignorance, which is what the Net Bible does. And the Net Bible is a credible translation that does a lot of hard work in its translation and even provides in the footnotes why they made the translation decisions. And in the Net Bible, they state this for 3:11, quote, "He has placed ignorance in the human heart." He has placed ignorance in the human heart. And this is a legitimate conclusion. Don't turn your nose up at it and say, well, that's ridiculous. It might be ridiculous because you're used to hearing one thing, but be fair to the text and say, why did they come to that conclusion? Well, they have different reasons, and there's scholarship behind it, but this is my case for eternity. Eternity and its synonyms are the terms consistently used throughout the Scriptures. Forever, forever and ever, eternity, that very similar kind of language. And more importantly, it's how the word is most consistently used in the book of Ecclesiastes. And there could be an aberration, and there could be a change, but you got to have a good reason for it. So it appears to be very consistent and a good choice. But ignorance does communicate what's happening because God's put something in the hearts of man so that man can't know. So it's an important discussion because it reflects a major element of the book as a whole and the tension that Solomon consistently articulates, a tension that the word choice of ignorance would consistently express, but that eternity appears to create a challenge with. It's hard to understand eternity. Ignorance makes more sense, but in the tension there's resolution. The tension is that man wants to know more than he can. Do you see that? Do you on any level, have you felt that? Solomon felt it intimately. I've observed, I've seen the affairs of God and man, and I want to know what's going to happen. And that appetite's been put in there by God himself. He so badly wants to know what will happen with his works when he is gone, and not knowing, he cries out, it's vanity. He wants to know who will take his place. He wants to know what will pass after him. He wants to know, but he cannot. He cannot. And this awareness that supersedes his finite relationship with time, and this awareness is rooted in because eternity has been placed in his heart. Eternity or forever has been placed in his heart by the Creator who has absolute knowledge, who feels no such tension, and who demands to be trusted in the process. Do you see what it's been driving toward? You can't know. You've been created with an awareness to desire to know. You can't know, and so what are you forced to do? It demands that you look to the one who knows all things. You can't, so look. It forces you to a proper disposition. You created temporal man. The Creator has made man's works good too. He expects man to do good, and we see that modeling his Creator. And these things are God's gifts to man. It's not just tension. God's given man work. You might not know what will come of your work, but God has gifted you with work, and you're to do good in your work. So in this regard, ignorance is the thrust of the argument, and eternity is the key to understanding it. So the consistent tension that man is constrained to the finite in time, and he has in his heart the infinite and eternity, and he can't reconcile the tension of his limitation and experience or perception. But what does he do? What are you left to do? What are you left to do with that tension? You're left to submit yourself in humility and worship and fear, to submit to the order of a God who does supersede time and operates on the eternal, who appoints the elements of time in their proper places, securing his own fixed actions as he so chooses, and when he does it, it's beautiful and it's right and it's good. So again, this leaves a tension, but the tension is best resolved in submission, in obedience, in doing good, and enjoying the good gifts that God has given, being pleased to give. He's been pleased to give you in this temporal experience of life. And what a kindness. Only going to be so long. In terms of eternity, not very long. But he gives good gifts. That's a kindness. And it drives us to our third point. Our third point, third section, and these are much shorter, but they are very, very valuable. Solomon's observation regarding God's gift to man, verses 12 and 13. I perceive that there is nothing better for them but to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. With Solomon's second observation, we continue to see a development of this larger theme of work. Work, work, work. Man, you have been created to work and work to the glory of God. Here it appears positive, nothing better. That should always get your attention. When the scriptures say there's nothing better, I want that. There's nothing better. He says joyful. He says do good. He uses the word pleasure, God's gift to man. This is how he talks about work. So much of the Ecclesiastes account is toil and struggle and vanity, but he's saying it's good. And it's good in the context that we've just addressed, the poems on God structuring all things. They're beautiful in their time. Eternity's in our heart. There's a tension, but the resolution is we trust him and we work and we work and we do good things to him who has given us good things. You can also recall that in the early portion of chapter 2, Solomon makes it clear that while he enjoyed and derived pleasure from his various works, it was a vain exercise. You recall that. That's where I stood before you last, and I gave you an account that he built houses and vineyards, and he did all these things, and he didn't say, boy, that was terrible. He said, I found pleasure in it. There was pleasure in his work, but it was vanity. Why? Because it was a pursuit of pleasure in its own right. But here we see a proper balance, and that work and toil can be properly enjoyed. We see almost the exact parallels to this passage in 2:24 through 26, 5:18 and 19. And with these, we see the value of enjoying life and work, as these things are God's gift to man. It's not all doom and gloom. It's not all vanity. There is a context in which we are being driven to fear God and keep his commandments. And in that, we have exhorted you that it is not all vanity. So hear Solomon say it now. It's good. And again, I would remind you, this is a sweeping observation that is addressed to man as a whole, not just those who are in Jerusalem, but man as a whole, man who is cursed to work by the sweat of his brow. But remember, work was not an element of the curse any more than childbearing was an element of the curse. The difference is it was going to happen before, but now it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard, but it's good, pleasurable, enjoyable. So what a kindness. What a kindness that Solomon tells us. This gift of God that man can at least enjoy his toil. You're going to toil. You're going to work. You're going to work hard. You're going to struggle. You're going to die. It's going to be left to somebody else. But you can enjoy it. Further, in addition to being joyful and doing good, one's whole life, everyone should eat, drink, and take pleasure in all their work. Now, this is not a colloquialism for a more hedonistic focus on life, but a natural life consists of eating, drinking. So again, what a kindness that we can add pleasure to this. What a kindness. It's not, oh, this is all hedonistic. Eat, drink, have pleasure. No, we've been created for these things. Exercise them with excellence and wisdom and faithfulness. The tension you're going to feel is the fact that there's a before and there's an after, but enjoy what God's given you. Now, we cannot overlook that man is also to do good, as we've seen in the text. So by what means can man be joyful and do good? Man can be joyful and do good when man fears God and keeps his commandments. Nothing better. Nothing better for man than to be joyful, to do good as long as he lives, that he takes pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. God's gift to man who is restricted in time while having eternity in his heart. What a kind gift. Temporal life, pleasurable work, doing good. How do we do good? We do it by fearing God and keeping his commandments. Fourth section, Solomon's observation regarding God's superior work and the end to which it should drive us. Verses 14 and 15. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. So here we have again our fourth section, Solomon's observation regarding God's superior work and the ends to which it should drive us. Now, with Solomon's third and final observation in this text, we again see the overt focus on the works of God, which bracket the direct treatment of man's works. So we've seen the works of God, the works of man, now the works of God. Man's work finds its merit, its value, its place in the works of God. So here we see what God does, God has done, God seeks. Further, not only do God's works bracket the treatment of man's works, but here they are shown to be superior. Don't say, oh, well, the works of man isn't that exciting. The works of God are by far superior. It is man who is constrained by time, and his works reflect this. God who makes all things beautiful in their time, and his works endure forever. His works cannot be added to or taken away from. So again, God's works endure forever. God's works cannot be added to, and God's works cannot be taken away from. Recognize your place in time and eternity and in terms of the works that you do versus the works of God. Even the natural works of creation that outlast man testify to this, as we see in chapter 1, verse 4. Quote, a generation of man goes, and a generation of man comes, but the earth remains forever. The earth not being some eternal existence, but the very crafty handiwork of God. Man comes, man goes, but God's work endures. And God has done these magnificent works for a reason. And why? Look at your text. Look at your text here. That man who lives in time might learn to fear before him. Temporal life, do good, fear God. Before him who makes all things, before him who makes all things beautiful in their time, before him who is sovereign over man's days, before him who works and endures, whose works endure forever and cannot be added to or taken away, that is the one who we must fear before. And fearing God is a grace that not all men know. I know that sounds so strange to the evangelical culture that says, I don't have to fear God, I can embrace him like he's my old longtime uncle or boyfriend. The scriptures say to fear God. And Solomon says you had best fear God. And it's a grace that not all men know. So the fact that God has done something so that you, man, might fear before him, that's a magnificent kindness. We know from 8:12 to 13, again, because we're operating within the scope of the whole book here, that the absence of the fear of God costs the wicked, and its presence blesses the ones who do have it. An absence of the fear of God is not a better relationship with God. It is a consequence that the wicked suffer. The righteous profit from it. And I would contend that it's the fear of God that provides the necessary context that man can have joy in life and satisfaction in his work. It is the fear of God that not only keeps one from folly, it drives one to God and an obedient living. It presses you. Further, while the fear of God is first addressed here in Ecclesiastes, a major theme, first time on scene in the book here, So while it's the first time that it's addressed in the book of Ecclesiastes, while other main themes have made an appearance, toil and time and struggle, they've made their appearance in 1 and 2 in the early parts of 3, but first time, but major theme. Don't lose sight of that. So here, 3:14, the fear of God is what the works and goodness of God is driving man to for his good. In 5:7, the instruction is that God is the one whom you must fear. In 8:12, the sinner may look to be doing well, but again, it's truthfully well for those who fear God. And at the seminal conclusion of the book, what we constantly, week after week, say, look, look, look. 12:13, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. God's driving you to fear him, and that's the charge that the book concludes with. The fear of God, a substantial element in the scriptures, and I think commonly reduced to some kind of general reverence for God without acknowledging its genuine elements of being overwhelmed, undone, broken, and even terrified before a holy and awesome God. You can't say Isaiah said, "Woe is me, I revere God." He was undone. So it was particularly encouraging for me to see Douglas O'Donnell, one of the commentators, his summarization of the fear of God. I love it when people articulate things well. He calls it a trembling trust. It is not merely trust, but a trust that trembles before God. The fear of God is a fearful thing. So hear me. You are a creature, all of you. You are creatures. You're creatures that are constrained in time with an awareness that there was a time before you, there will be a time after you, that there are things that are beautiful in their time, and that ultimately you have so very little control over all these things that God orders these things and will have his way. So you who are formed from the dust and in short time will return to the dust, had best heed this counsel. Fear God, keep his commandments. Do good in the time that God has given you. And how do you do this? By fearing God, keeping his commandments. Finally, we come to the concluding elements of this third observation. Not the end of our text, but we're getting toward the end here. The statement here appears to be pointing back to 1:9. Quote, what has been is what will be. What has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. So again, this is going to be in verse 15 here. That which already has been, that which is to, that which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. So again, we see that thematic element. We saw it in verse 1:9. We see it in 6:10. We see this further with qualification. Whatever has come to be already has been named, and it is known what man is. So here Solomon appears to be tying in his treatments of the cyclical nature of affairs of this world and the works of God. He's saying, yes, there are things that are redundant in this experience of life and creation. And these are the works of God, and some of them overlap. And he's tying that into the works of man, and he's tying that into a right perspective of God and eternity and time. Now, regarding the last portion of 3:15, I have another quote that was quite encouraging when you're studying this text. Quote, this is a difficult phrase to translate and even more difficult to interpret. Twice. But it's okay. It's a difficult phrase to translate and even more difficult to interpret. And what is he referring to? God seeks what has been driven away. So what are our key words here? Our key words are seeks, required, sought, searched out, inquired. Driven away, pursued, chased, followed, or persecuted. And which is interesting because driven away, it's very much like its New Testament Greek counterpart, where when the Apostle Paul says in Philippians chapter 3 that I'm striving, I am pursuing, that he's pursuing Christ Jesus, he's pursuing that chief reward. That word is the same exact word for persecute, pursue, chase. Same with the Hebrew counterpart here. So here we have God seeks what has been driven away, what's been persecuted, what's been chased, what he's seeking out. And to be honest, I'm left in unresolved tension, so I'll provide two reasonable conclusions. I wrestled with it. I found two men that I can rest with, and I'm not resolved. So this is two potential resolutions that I'm sufficiently satisfied to bring to you here. The first is by Dwayne Garrett. He argues that this is a bridge to the next section and is stating that God is seeking the persecuted, meaning that he holds their persecutor accountable. And he basically goes on to explain that in the next portion of the chapter that Pastor Rick will address, you have things that ought not be, okay? The righteous and the wicked mingled. The things are confused in that regard. And he says, you know what? He has just addressed the good things, the works of God, the works of man. And therefore, God is going to seek out those who would seek to usurp or undermine that. And it's a bridge to that next portion. I think that's reasonable. Not sure, though. That's the bridge conclusion. It's leaching over to verse 16. It's part of 15, but it's bleeding over to give continuity. The other position is held by Trimper Longman. He argues that it is God who is seeking what has passed, or more precisely, that God continues with the cyclical patterns articulated here and throughout the book. So he's keeping the continuity of verse 15. He says that he seeks what was, and what was is also what will be. Did you follow that? I think it would be easier just to read the text, wouldn't it? That which is already has been. Which is, has been, that which is to be already has been. So you see the cyclical nature of it, of this temporal time and experience? It's tough. It's either bridging the next part or bringing continuity to it. I don't have a lot of resolution on that, and I'll leave that in Pastor Rick's hands if he wants to bridge that connection to this verse 16. And it very well may be an acceptable bridge, and I'd be grateful to find that out. But as we conclude tonight, we have observed through Solomon's observations, we have benefited from a man who is wiser than we will be and who has observed his world. And so what have we observed through the scope of Solomon here? We've seen man's great tension with time and toil, verses 10 to 11. We've seen God's gift to man, 3:12 and 13. And then we've seen God's superior work and the end to which it should drive us, namely to fear God, verses 14 and 15. And we know where we are ultimately headed with the book, chapter 12, verse 13. You, O man, who are temporal, who will return to dust, but have that tension because eternity is in your heart, who are called to do good works and to enjoy this life, the charge to you is the end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Let's pray.